signed, sealed, and more goods set to be delivered. As Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and EU leaders made the landmark trade deal official, the path widened for more than $100 billion worth of products and services traded between the two to increase.
This will create a GDP worth about $45 billion and 290,000 jobs for Japan, which will become the new engine of the Abenomics.
Set to take effect late next year, the deal removes tariffs on nearly all EU exports to Japan. Meanwhile, Japanese car makers stand to gain from reduced duties on vehicles and auto parts. The deal is expected to give Europe's agricultural and food products a major boost. Exports of European cheese, wine, and pork are among some products set to jump. It will also bring Japanese trade rules in line with international standards, aimed at increasing transparency and market access. Taking place against the backdrop of an ongoing trade war between the United States and China, officials from both the EU and Japan praised the deal as a win for free trade and multilateralism.
This is an act of enormous strategic importance for the rules-based international order at a time when some are questioning this order. We are sending a clear message that we stand together against protectionism.
Analysts say the deal could further isolate the US economy, which is flexing its America First policy in full force. A move many worry could still be strong enough to bring global growth to a standstill. Laila Humairah, TRT World.
Let's bring in Heinz Kurz. He's an economics professor at Austria's University of Graz. He's also a member of the European Japan Experts Association. Professor, it's great to have you on the show. Let's talk about the US first, before we get to the nuts and bolts of the EU-Japan trade deal. Where does this leave the US? Does it leave the US even more isolated on the global trade front?
Well, thanks, first of all, for having me. As regards the US, I think there is no doubt that they are in an atmosphere of self-defeating policies. I mean, protectionism will hurt its own economy, it will isolate the economy, and it might trigger waves of reduces in effective demand, unemployment throughout the world, unless other countries are prepared to cope with the problem that has been created by President Trump. It is a self-defeating strategy.
Right. From the EU's point of view, do you think the EU can make up for any loss of trade that it's suffering with the US as trade tariffs go up between those two by doing more trade with Japan via this new deal?
Well, I think it can't make up all losses, but it can make up quite a few of them. And the question is, of course, what will be, in a dynamic world, the overall outcome of the policy of President Trump? My feeling is that it will have tremendous trade diverting, but also creating effects. And that all depends on how the other countries that are important players in the game will react. It depends on their policies. So, I mean, it's very difficult to forecast what will happen, not least because you might always count upon the intelligence of the American people and some of the administrators to stop Mr. Trump from carrying on this policy.
Well, we can all hope that cooler heads do prevail. Let's talk about it from China's perspective for a moment, because they are the other big player in all of this. As the EU signs this deal, I mean, in fact, just before Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk went to Tokyo, they were in Beijing. What are the prospects of an EU-China trade deal?
Well, I think that would also, of course, lead to an increase in international trade. And again, here, the problem is, as with the European and Japanese trade treaty, to get rid of not only tariffs but also rules and regulations which hamper trade. I mean, the Japanese are very good at that. Maybe it's even at least as important as tariffs. And the Chinese are also quite good at protecting their country against imports to some extent by having a large regulations that have to be overcome by firms, and that is particularly difficult for small and medium-sized firms. So this would have another trade-enhancing effect, which in the end might then show that the Trump policy is contained and hits essentially not the rest of the world that much, but mostly the United States.
You sound quite optimistic about China, but the European Union also has a lot of the same gripes against China that the US does, in particular with things like intellectual property. I mean, how realistic do you think it is that China and the EU are going to be able to sit at the same table and hammer out a deal that's similar, perhaps, to the deal that they've hammered out with Japan?
Well, I think what is happening right now, I mean, the so-called trade war, that will tell a lesson to these countries, and China in particular, because they have huge trade surpluses. And if the United States cut them down quite a bit, then, of course, they have to react in one way or another. They might be forced to admit new treaties with other countries they wouldn't have admitted otherwise. So maybe Trump has, in the end, a good effect on those relationships. He might trigger a situation which for the rest of the world, and perhaps even eventually for the United States, brings us back to more reasonable rules and regulations in the world economy.
Professor Kurz, you've been following global trade for many years. It wasn't all that long ago that Japan was the global pariah when it came to free trade, being accused of dumping cars in the UK and in Europe and in America. Do you find it ironic that Japan is now being held up as something of a bastion of free trade?
Well, you see, again, they were forced to come to terms with the situation. And as I mentioned earlier on, it was not so much tariffs, perhaps, but rules, regulations, standards, worldwide standards they wouldn't accept. And every firm that wanted to import goods into Japan had difficulties because of the standards they imposed. So I think they also reflect the need that is to change your policy in case of stagnation and problems of effective demand in your own country. I think they wouldn't have done that if they had been on a more prosperous path in recent times.
Professor Heinz Kurz of the European Japan Experts Association, thank you very much for joining us on Money Talks.